Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the Wine and Spirit Wholesalers of America's webinar entitled Tariffs on Wine and Spirits, Current Impact and Future Threats. I'm Michelle Korsmo, CEO of WSWA and your moderator today. So since May of 2019, when the U.S. Trade Representative first announced its initiation of the Section 301 investigation into the large civil aircraft dispute, better known to all of us as the Boeing Airbus case, WSWA has, along with our industry coalition partners, been fighting to remove these tariffs on wine and spirit imports from the EU, including doing the work of asking our members of Congress and the administration to contact USTR, making the case for excluding our industry from this unrelated trade dispute. As you know, in October of 2019, USTR moved forward with imposing tariffs on a host of EU origin wine and spirit products. And in February of 2020, after months of continued pressure from us and from the industry, they renewed these tariffs on the same products at the current rate. A new economic analysis by WSWA finds that the duties placed on the current list of effective products will lead to an effective 46% increase in the price of distilled spirits and cordials, and a 41.1% increase in the price of wine that could be passed on to the consumer. The analysis also found that the U.S. alcohol industry is poised to lose 92,570 jobs and nearly $3.8 billion in wages, costing the U.S. economy $11 billion in 2020. And that brings us to today. On August 12th, USTR must again review these tariffs and decide whether to increase or decrease the rate or modify the products subject to the tariffs in this case. In a concerning development, USTR also included a supplemental list of products that could be subject to tariffs. These included vodka, gin, beer, and other wine and spirits. WSWA is doing everything in our power to illustrate to USTR that these tariffs are adversely impacting American businesses and consumers. And doubling down on these tariffs could be a knockout blow to many in our industry as we continue to weather the storm of the global pandemic that's greatly damaged our on-premise retail partners' operations and disrupted the entire alcohol supply chain. Earlier this month, we received some welcome relief as USTR responded to our efforts and made the decision to not include French sparkling wine and champagne on tariff goods related to France's implementation of a digital service tax. There's still work to do, but that shows that progress is possible. So with all of this in mind, today, we are fortunate to be joined by industry and policy experts to talk about how current tariffs on EU wine and spirit products are impacting the alcohol industry and how the prospect of new or expanded tariffs endanger the ability of our businesses to grow, create new jobs, and continue to provide consumers with the most diverse products in the world, especially in this new world of COVID. I am looking forward to these four diverse perspectives from both sides of the pond, and their thoughts on how we can work together to remove our products from the tariff list and continue to thrive in our interconnected industry. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy from Florida's 7th Congressional District. Congresswoman Murphy has graciously joined us today to talk a bit about how we found ourselves involved in these unrelated trade disputes in the first place and provide a state of play. Congresswoman Murphy currently serves on the influential House Ways and Means Committee, where she is a member of the Subcommittee on Trade. She is also chair of the fiscally conservative Democratic Blue Dog Coalition and Future Forum, a group of younger members of Congress who are focused on issues and opportunities for millennial Americans. Previously, Congresswoman Murphy was a businesswoman and college instructor after serving as a national security specialist in the office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, where she received numerous awards for her distinguished service, including the Secretary of Defense's Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service. What an honor. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and welcome, Congresswoman Murphy.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and thank you for that kind introduction. I really appreciate you inviting me to be here with you all this afternoon. Also, thanks to the whole team at the Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America for all your hard work on tariff policy. You know, your advocacy efforts before Congress and the USTR are extremely valuable. I know it's work you prefer not to have to engage in, but this is just unfortunately the reality that you're finding your industry in. I also know how deeply your industry, the workers you employ and the customers you serve are being impacted by tariffs. You know, you're really a blameless bystander that's been caught up in the crossfire of multiple trade wars. And let me just say a few words about how I approach your specific issue as a matter of general principle. As you likely know, I'm among one of the most pro-trade members of Congress. I used to think that saying I was a pro-trade Democrat was a lonely circle, but these days it feels like saying you're a pro-trade member of Congress is also a lonely circle. It's a surprising place to find myself. I do think, while I am pro-trade, I think that a rules-based trading system tends to strengthen our economy and create jobs on both the import and the export side. And it also gives consumers more choices at better prices. So I've been a vocal and consistent critic of this administration's imposition of tariffs on imports under both Section 232 and Section 301. You know, I think in each case, the administration acted unilaterally without WTO authorization or congressional approval. In the case of the 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel imports from basically every country, the argument that these tariffs are necessary for our national security, I think, is a little thin. What has happened is that these tariffs have led to some very painful counter tariffs on our exports. And then in the case of 301, on a range of Chinese products, I'm the first person to argue that China's trade and investment practices violate the letter and the spirit of their WTO commitments. And I'm actually quite hawkish on China, but I do worry that these tariffs and the counter tariffs imposed by Beijing have really hurt American businesses and families without really doing much to change China's offensive practices. My concern is that these tariffs are a self-inflicted wound on the American economy, and that's been intensified by the COVID pandemic. You know, at a time when American businesses and American families are facing these unprecedented challenges and really economic constraints, these tariffs are making a terrible situation even worse. And so that's why I've called on the administration, at the very least, to halt these import taxes during this public health crisis. You know, it's a request that they ignored. They don't seem to, they're interested in tax cuts, just not the one tax cut that they have complete control over and could, implement themselves by simply putting a halt to the import taxes. But anyways, when it comes to tariffs and that USTR has imposed on your industry and other industries in connection with the Airbus-Boeing dispute, they're somewhat different than the tariffs I think USTR imposed under 232 and 301 because they were authorized by the WTO pursuant to a long legal process. However, my core concern remains the same here. Despite highlighting that distinction, I'm worried that in an effort to penalize the EU for certain practices, the administration is hurting innocent businesses, workers, and customers in sectors completely unrelated to aviation. And they're doing so at a time when you're already facing extreme and in some cases existential challenges due to COVID. We have to remember tariffs are a weapon, and like any weapon, they need to be wielded with the utmost care. And I think trade policy should be more nuanced than what we're seeing out of this administration. I think if we're going to impose tariffs, whatever the circumstances are, we ought to be trying to minimize the pain to those parties who have done to maximize pain to the parties who've done something wrong and minimize the pain to the folks who have done nothing wrong, like your industry. I'm not really sure that USTR is sensitive enough to this goal. And in fact, during my last hearing with Ambassador Lighthizer, I tried to point out some of the pain that's being felt by American businesses and American consumers. And I think his response was, "What pain?" So I think continued advocacy efforts on your behalf hopefully will sensitize the USTR a bit more to the domestic impact of his foreign trade policy. But I do know that many members of Congress are sensitive to the impact, and that's largely because of your advocacy efforts. So I'll be joining a letter to USTR led by Mr. Pasquarel, urging USTR to apply these tariffs in a more thoughtful way and to be mindful of the fact that the food and beverage industry has done nothing wrong in this, and that you're facing significant challenges in the midst of this pandemic. So I hope they'll respond favorably. I'd urge you to keep your advocacy efforts going. They make a real difference. So thank you again for having me today.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Murphy. That was exactly the message that we needed to kick off this conversation, because it really helps us know that what we're saying is making a difference. And I really appreciated your perspective about how we think about how we use tariffs as a weapon, and to use that wisely. And the point about how this industry, which is unrelated to the airline industry specifically for Section 301, is caught up in a fight that is not our fight at a time when we don't have the extra to give. So your thoughts, I think, will really help us as we continue to improve our messages to Ambassador Lighthouser and the administration on why, as you say, this tax that they have control over needs to go away. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope you guys have a great event. Take care.
Thank you. So with that, I am very excited to start our panel discussion. I think that was exactly the right kickoff. I would like to introduce our panel to everyone today. First, we are joined by Karen Betts, who is the CEO of the Scotch-Whisky Association, which represents Scotch whisky producers in the UK. We also have with us David Kenney, who is a partner and VP of Uncorked, an importer and distributor based in New Orleans. We have Burton May, who is the Executive Vice President of Portfolio Management for Opici Family Distributing, an importer and distributor based in New Jersey. And finally, Eric Branstad, who is the Managing Director at Mercury, a public affairs firm, and former Senior White House Advisor at the U.S. Department of Commerce and Chief Aide for U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. Really happy to have all of you with us. I think you're going to prompt some very interesting discussion. And so for those of you who are participating in this webinar with us, know that we will have time for Q&A at the end of our conversation. And if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A app that you see at the bottom of your screen, the little button at the bottom. And Cody Tucker from WSWA is on with us, and he will be monitoring your questions and bringing them to the panel as we continue. So with that, Eric, let's start with you by really helping get at the heart of the issue here. You know, we heard from Congresswoman Murphy, but I think you can bring really perspective as to the intent of the administration and what they're thinking on why we would want to put pressure right now on the EU to resolve this trade dispute. And then knowing that what we've been telling the administration and what they need to understand is that the majority of the pressure is felt by the American hospitality workers, and all of that compounded by the current pandemic is definitely problematic. So our question to you is there really an administrative sense or an administration sense that these tariffs are having an adverse effect on American businesses and workers?
Well, thank you, Michelle. The administration is absolutely sensitive to American businesses and certainly to the American worker. It's very important for U.S. companies to show and comment how they have been adversely impacted, similar to what the Congresswoman said. The next hard part is navigating the U.S. Trade Representative's complex exclusion process. The wine and spirits is unfortunately and unintentionally in the crosshairs of the USTR's, their efforts to tariff culturally significant European goods as part of their efforts to combat the Airbus subsidies. Your voice and this Webinar is very important to make that happen.
That's good, Ed. I think generally I would express what I know everybody's thinking about is that it's hard to understand that they're sensitive to what's happening to American businesses, yet we've seen this continue, at least in one more round. And so, so we'll continue to try to make that point as we reach out to Ambassador Lighthouser and members of Congress. I think it would be great for us to get to know the wholesalers and importers that are with us. So let's talk to you and talk a little bit about the company you work for and the role you play there. I'm curious if you could share with everyone the impact of the 25% tariffs on EU wine and spirits and how that has affected your business here in the US. Also, has it changed the way that you do business with EU suppliers? So if you could, Burton, let's start with you and tell us a little bit about your business.
Sure, Michelle. Well, I've been with the company for the past 20 years, and I've served in different senior sales roles within the company. Currently, I'm the Executive Vice President of Portfolio Management, which basically means that I'm the guy I look around to see to make sure that we have the right portfolio in the right marketplace, we have the right products, we're making money, the products that we buy sell through, and that we service the marketplace for what the marketplace is looking for. Speaking of tariffs, I think the Representative Murphy put it very succinctly, laid out our case, and basically understands from our industry that we're the ones who are suffering. And that's through no fault of our own. In our particular case, early on when these tariffs started in October of 2019, we got with all of our suppliers. We had conversations with them. And in a lot of cases, our suppliers have helped us out with some extra discounts, with some price reductions to make sure that the tariffs did not affect the price to the consumer. They could only do that for so long. So starting in March or April of this year, 2020, we've started to receive price increases from a lot of our European suppliers that have been affected by the tariffs. Specifically to us, we ate about 10% of the tariffs from that October through March, April period. And for us as a company, that was approximately 1% in gross profit. So, that's a big impact for a family company. Granted, we have operations in 7 marketplaces, and then we have our import company. But 1% margin hit, especially with the pandemic that's going on right now and the issue that all the marketplaces have with the hospitality industry basically closed, that's a huge impact for us.
Right. Sounds like it's significant. I think people don't realize what a difference that 1% makes on an ability for a company to grow. And frankly, in many cases, like we are dealing with right now, stay open or succeed. So thank you for sharing that, Burton. David, you've got a very interesting perspective with your business and how it's been impacted with the tariffs. Please share with the group a little bit more about you.
Sure, thanks. So I'm the Vice President of Uncorked. We're an importer and distributor. I feel like a lot of similarities between myself and Burton, except being a little smaller. I crush boxes, sweep floors, do it all. But we're a small, mid-sized distributor in Louisiana. Focused on mostly artisan producers in terms of wine and spirits, although a full book. And in terms of the impacts of the tariffs, similar story to Burton's. Excuse me. First, in the fall of 19, our time and attention was diverted away from sales, the busiest time of the year, to look at the impacts of the tariffs and to mitigate those impacts. In 2020, the spring, a lot like Burton said, first we had absorbed the cost of the tariffs, or a portion of them. In the spring, prices started to increase. Those price increases showed themselves in terms of a 1.6% reduction in our wine sales year over year. The cost of the tariffs for a typical container for us could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000 to $15,000. So we've delayed our containers. We're running our inventory a lot leaner, which can lead to difficulties And we've cut our expenses as much as possible, even delaying 2 full-time job positions that we were scheduled to put into place.
Right. That's a very real example of what we see in the statistics. Thank you for sharing that with the group, David. So now let's get a perspective from the other side that we don't necessarily hear very often. Karen, can you tell us more about your association and the impact of tariffs from your end as a supplier? How has the 25% tariff on single malt scotches impacted your members who are exporting Scotch whiskey to the US? And has it changed the way that they do business with their US partners?
Oh, thanks, Michelle, and thanks so much for having us this evening. Yeah, the Scotch Whisky Association, the association that I represent, we represent Scotch whisky producers. So we represent 90% of all Scotch produced. We've got 74 member companies, and they range from large multinationals through to micro companies. And yes, the tariff has had a real and negative impact on Scotch whisky. The US is our biggest and most valuable market. It has been for decades. Americans love Scotch whisky, and that's great for us. We are also developing a taste for American whisky, which is doing very well in the UK. So long live transatlantic whiskies. But yes, I mean, in the last year, we exported nearly $1.5 billion worth of Scotch whisky to the US. So you are a fantastic market for us. Now those exports have started to drop because tariffs have come into place. So in the 10 months that tariffs have been imposed, exports of Scotch whisky to the US have dropped 30%. So that is really material for our member companies. And it's particularly hard for small producers, I think, at the outset, particularly those smaller, those more niche brands are finding it much, much harder to get importers and distributors to take their product because, of course, you know, as Burton was saying, if you're having to pass the tariff on in price rises, which I think most companies are now, then you're putting the price up for consumers, and some importers and distributors are not sure that they're going to sell the whiskey at that point. So I think it's really hard. You're also seeing less money spent on advertising, promotion, that sort of thing. So that's less money to American advertising firms, to the advertising industry. And I think, you know, longer term, particularly with the existential and extreme challenge that Congresswoman Murphy referred to combined with COVID, I think there's a real risk that some single malt brands will have to exit the market. So it is really serious for us.
Yeah, without a doubt. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Karen. So Eric, we understand that USTR is now considering expanding tariffs to possibly include vodka, gin, and beer from the UK, Germany, France, and Spain, among these other products that we've been talking about today. From your experience working in the administration, can you elaborate on how USTR makes their decisions and decides what products put on the list? What's their thought process?
It's complicated. In short, you know, while I'm no longer on the inside, I'll share some of my thoughts on where we're at, and, you know, to answer your question. In my opinion, the thought process comes down to putting tariffs on luxury goods and consumables from Europe that the customer is willing to pay more for. I think we all have different ideas as far as what that means, but I think that's ultimately what they're looking at. They do not want to further damage an already post-COVID vulnerable American economy. We all know that. So that's where this balance becomes that much tougher. It has been well pointed out that through the negotiations over the last couple of years, the EU has specifically not purchased US ag goods at a time that we have been really pushing the ag goods with, you know, via the China trade war. There's been a glut of US ag goods that the EU has chose not to purchase. And so I think all of those things bring into an account that where their mind's at and where their targets are. And that's where it comes in important, again, for us to let them know, you know, really what the reality is and how this is affecting all of your businesses.
Right, right. Thank you. And that's a great thing that actually makes me think back to you, Karen, if we can follow up on what Eric was talking about. USTR's also potentially looking at tariffs that include Scotch blends. Can you give a little bit more specific example of what kind of impact that would have on your members? You talked about that earlier, but if we expand the tariffs from single malts to Scotch, or have that even combined, what does that do?
I think that's potentially pretty devastating. Single malts are about a third of our exports to the US, so the other 2/3 are blends. So what you're doing is you're imposing a tariff on a much greater volume of imported whiskey at that point. And I think that is really pretty serious. And that's where I think, you know, you really will see an impact on jobs in the US, because, you know, there are many specialist whiskey bars in the US, or there are many whiskey bars that sell Scotch or other parts of the hospitality sector. And, you know, if Scotch whisky is under a lot of pressure, is becoming too expensive for consumers, if the demand is going down, I don't think it's possible to say, well, actually those servers will be serving some other drink, or, you know, the hospitality industry will be able to make it up somehow. I don't think that businesses necessarily can turn around that quickly. So I think it will be a really negative escalation of the situation if that were to happen. You know, for us, and, you know, I think it's everybody listening to this knows, and everyone involved, you know, the European and UK and US spirits industries have been so joined up for years in promoting free trade. It has, you know, hugely benefited producers, but also the much wider economy, from distributors, retailers to restaurants. And you know, it would seem very unfair at that point to hit us in what I think would be a very significant way.
Certainly, makes sense. Burton, what about you? How would an increase or an expansion of tariffs, let's say on Italian still wines, impact Opici's business? Do you have options in that scenario? Do you simply replace these wines with a domestic alternative, like the administration kind of wants everyone to believe?
Well, it's easier said than done. For us as a company, just in our import company alone, 40% of their business is Italian. So currently, that's not being tariffed. If the new tariffs go through, it's 40% of those goods are going to be tariffed. That's going to make a huge impact for them as a company, not only for us on the distribution side, but also for the national platform that they have for distributors around the country. You know, it's one thing to say that you know, they picked on our industry to put a 25% tariff on. What does that really mean to the consumer? Well, let's say you go to the grocery store every week and you buy the same $100 worth of goods. And the next week you buy that same $100 worth of goods and they say, no, it's $125 now. It's like, through no fault of yours, you picked the same product, right? It's what you wanted to buy as a consumer. It's your choice. You brought it to the cash register and they told you it would cost more. And it didn't cost more because the costs went up or the transportation went up or anything like that. It went up because our industry got caught between a rock and a hard place in this Boeing Airbus debacle that's been going on for the last 15 or 16 years. So for us as a company, for 40% of the business that will be taxed in the future, you know, we're going to have to look at things like, you know, do we hire more people? Do we expand? Do we buy more trucks? Do we have, you know, do we look at investing in the business, because our cash flow is going to be hurt dramatically by that.
Right, right. And David, I think when we think about Uncorked and your business there, where you really focus on French wines, you know, same question to you. I mean, how does that impact your business, and what are you thinking about?
Well, I think the impacts to our business can be illustrated if you look at the impacts to our area. So if I can, I'll go through a couple of numbers and you kind of get to your answer. We sell to roughly 60% of our accounts being on premise, so restaurants and bars. Bars and restaurants account for $1 billion in taxes alone, according to the Louisiana Restaurant Association in Louisiana. And in New Orleans specifically, About 6% of the workforce is directly involved in the hospitality industry. And then when you multiply that with supporting companies, you can imagine where those numbers go. I want to be real blunt right here. COVID has these restaurants on the ropes. They're fighting for their lives. Louisiana Restaurant Association sent out an article that they're predicting 1 in 4 restaurants in the city will not survive. I think any increase in tariffs would literally be a nail in the coffin for the restaurant industry in New Orleans. And as that goes, the state goes, and obviously there goes our business. And for some of the listeners, if you all are wondering, I'll list a couple of restaurants that are either closed, they've closed and opened as things have vacillated back and forth, but K. Paul's closed, Revolution is closed currently, Dickie Brennan's restaurants, Admiral's restaurants, Commander's Palace, and I can go on and on, but I mean, these are big name, heavy hitter places. So an increase in tariffs would be horrible for my city, my business, but my city and my state too.
Right. Well, and to think about, as you say, those names for all of us that travel to New Orleans or used to travel to New Orleans for work and events, all of those names were ones that were highlights, right? The highlights of the trip. So it is devastating and really the fabric of your community, which is what's so important for everybody to understand. Karen, if we can ask you a question to talk a little bit about kind of as this starts to switch, one of the fears that I've been hearing from U.S. importers and our distributor members is that producer partners in the EU, because of the uncertainty here in the U.S. market, are going to shift their focus to other markets around the world where they're able to sell their products to businesses, and consumers potentially duty-free. So for example, Scotch has been rising in popularity in India with exports up, we know, 20% last year. Are you noticing an increased interest among your members for third markets due to our U.S. tariffs?
Well, I have to say we're a long way from having India as a duty-free market. We currently have a 150% import tariff into India.
That helps.
So we have problems in other places. But what I would say is, yes, I mean, Scotch whisky is exported all over the world. There isn't a single country in the world really that Scotch doesn't find its way to. So, so all of our producers, they will be looking to try to compensate for export losses to the US in other markets. And, we were, consistently until US tariffs came along and until now COVID came along, we've been in growth for some years. In 2019, exports grew nearly 5%. And that was particularly actually in Asia and Africa. So there are other opportunities out there. India is obviously, despite the 150% import tariff, a very important market for us, and exports have really been rising there. So companies will try to compensate. But what I would say is that nobody can turn on a sixpence. Exporting anywhere takes, as you will know, a degree of effort. You have to build your market. You have to find your importers, your distributors, the bars and restaurants that sell your whiskies, and you have to work out how to do the import procedures and all of those things. So our companies have invested a lot in the US market over the years, and they really won't want to lose that. And American consumers now are quite educated about Scotch whisky. You're a very sophisticated market. You take a massive range of brands that not all other markets do. So companies won't want to switch, but it really depends how long the tariff remains in place. It becomes very damaging the longer it is in place. The longer it's in place, the more we risk losing market share. And so, at that point, I think investments will go up in other markets. And I think, as I said earlier, I suspect that some smaller brands will be exiting the market already, which will limit consumer choice.
Yeah, it's interesting as we talk about how long the tariffs are in place. We know that these tariffs have to be reviewed by USTR every 180 days. But I want to talk now about the uncertainty that creates, because as an industry that's purchasing products well in advance so that we're bringing these products, across the pond, across the ocean, this really, as we look at an uncertainty in pricing, is problematic for our companies and cash flow problems. And so I was wondering, Burton, can you start by talking a little bit about some of the problems that you run into and how this uncertainty has potentially changed your purchasing behavior?
Well, sure. I mean, if you just look at the tariff, if you look at normal business, between us and Europe. Typically, and David knows this because he goes through it too, typically you buy a product. So let's say we buy a container of French wine today. The cost to bring that container here is the freight, the duty, and the internal revenue. Well, the duty and internal revenue are $3.12 on a typical 9-liter case of wine, which is a standard 12-bottle case of wine. Right now, if that cost of that good's $100, not only do we have to pay the $3.12, which is $3,100 and whatever per container, we have to pay 25% additional on the cost of the goods. So if the goods cost $100, you have to pay another $25,000 to get that same container here. So from a cash flow standpoint, it's a huge drain on assets. It's a huge drain on us. If they're going to add more tariff to this, if they're going to add more products to this, it's just going to compound the issue. And as Karen was, talking before, when you talk about Scotch or you talk about spirits, if they add the tariff to that, those products cost a lot more to start with. They're taxed a lot more, so there's a huge outlay currently. And if they put a 25 or 30 or even higher percent on that, that's just more dollars. That's just cash flow that we just don't have available to us. So that's going to impact what we buy in the future. And it'll also impact how we do our business in the future, whether we expand or we don't.
Right. Interesting. So let's talk about the supply chain issues. And David, I'm going to turn it to you. If you can talk a little bit about those supply chain issues that you're running into when tariffs make more products more expensive, like Burton has just explained, or potentially even unattainable. How does that impact the demand by on-premise retailers and consumers? And then, you've talked a lot about what you're dealing with specifically in Louisiana with the compounding effect of closures due to COVID-19.
Yeah, I'll take Burton's example and kind of expand it a little too first, because our containers, I said earlier, tariffs would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000 a year. Several containers a year would be normal for us in kind of prime operating terms, and you can do the math there. That's money straight off of our bottom line. As a small company, we don't have that kind of money to lose. Going back to the supply chains, we also buy from a number of importers, companies like Opici, but other companies obviously, and some of those importers have had out of stock situations, and being down the food chain a little, we find out about them kind of a little later, and we can't get the products, and then we have to turn around and tell our customers they don't have them. So the customers that are open find products somewhere else. So it's just direct loss of sales. So these out of stock issues that are being put into play because of the tariffs are causing us to lose business.
Which is tough.
Yeah, that's that simple.
All right, it is simple, and I think that we feel like we've been spreading that simple message with the administration, and it's interesting when we think about where the administration comes from in their position. Eric, as an industry, we're used to this free and fair trade with our European counterparts. We've been experiencing this for decades, and the administration says that it's their ultimate goal that we have free and fair trade. But we had that. So based on your experience, what's our best path forward to convincing the USTR that our products should be removed from the product lists of these unrelated trade disputes?
Well, a couple things. As I've always said, and I used to be a part of several of these negotiations from the inside. The president has been very clear with consistent messaging from day one from taking office. With every negotiation, he says fair and reciprocal. He, especially in relation to China trade, also this, and that's really what the USTR is thinking about. The president, the best case to be successful with USTR is to, first of all, identify the key economic impact data that points a very clear picture to the hardships you are facing now, and also, more importantly, into the future. The next
That's good. I feel good about that because, as I said at the top of this program, WSWA just came out with new data on the impact, and we've put that out, and I encourage everybody to find that from our website as they're looking for arguments to make, and we're sharing that information with our members. But go on, Eric, if you have other advice.
Well, and then take that, the next piece then would be to describe the impact downstream to retailers, vendors, customers. Take that same and really describe and share and show that narrative. And lastly, the voice needs to be loud and unified from you all to members of Congress, federal agencies, including the Department of Commerce, sometimes ITC, trade, really all the trade officials and anyone that touches it, and the White House, to prove exactly that data and that point. They certainly are listening. I've been successful in getting several companies off the list, and there's really no secret to it. It's just being upfront, straightforward, and honest, and telling them exactly where you're hurting and why you're hurting and how this is impacting your businesses and
right.
How you do it.
Great advice, and I appreciate the advice on expanding to anybody that's touching trade at commerce too, which is a good thing for us to think about here in these next few weeks. Karen, I want to switch, now that we've been talking about kind of the US market, let's do a quick follow-up with you on any advice that you have on how the US and the EU alcohol industries can better work together to get our products removed in this back and forth of disputes between the two entities, and back to our days of 0 for 0 trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are working very closely together now. We're very united, with Spirits Europe, with the Distilled Spirits Council in the US and us in the UK. And we are putting a huge amount of pressure, the same amount of pressure on the European Union and on the UK government, because now the UK has left the EU. The UK is doing things slightly differently, but we're putting pressure, equal pressure on Europe to lift their tariffs again and to take us out of it. I mean, we're pretty clear as Scotch Whisky that the reason we were put on USTR's list last year was because the European Union had put American whiskey on their list in response to the steel and aluminium tariffs. We said to them very clearly at the time, don't do that. We in the spirits industry have had tariff-free trade for more than 25 years. You have seen the prosperity benefits of that. Don't damage it. But they didn't listen, I'm afraid. They put a tariff on American whiskey, and here we are. So I think we have to keep on putting pressure on all politicians to stop allowing really two big aircraft companies on each side of the Atlantic slugging it out in litigation that has been going on for 15 years. If that's what they want to do, they can take all the time in the world, but please take us out of it. It's not our fight. So we keep on pressing those messages. The UK has the opportunity to do something a bit different now the UK has left the EU, and we're pressing the UK very hard to start a separate discussion with USTR between the UK and the US now to talk about those trade disputes and see if the UK and US couldn't at least resolve their differences a bit more quickly, which would hopefully provide some sort of resolution for Scotch whisky and for American whisky. But that, of course, wouldn't necessarily help the other categories of alcohol that are drawn into this at the moment.
Right. And it is good to see us working together on these issues, especially as you talked about with the increasing appreciation for U.S. whiskey in Europe. As you mentioned, the 25% tariffs on the American products, our American companies have lost nearly $340 million in sales just in that short amount of time that those tariffs have been in place, which is definitely devastating. And so it's nice that we can work together and rise all boats. So I've appreciated this conversation. I know we have a lot of questions that have come in from the participants, and let's get to that. Cody, do you want to chat with us a bit about some of the things we're hearing? And for those of you that are wondering, you can continue to type in your questions in the chat box below.
Absolutely. So opening it up to questions, if you'd like to ask a question for one of our panelists, please use the raise your hand function to be recognized. One question per person, please. And just as a reminder, everything is on the record and being recorded. So one question for Karen, following up on what you were kind of just talking about. Do you think that the UK may try to resolve its part of the Airbus dispute and the tariffs as part of the current US-UK free trade agreement?
So, I mean, from a technical point of view, a free trade agreement negotiation would be separate to a discussion on the trade disputes. But yes, we are absolutely saying to the UK government that they should open a parallel discussion at the same time as the FTA discussions are going on. They should have a parallel discussion about resolving the trade disputes, the steel and aluminium dispute, and the Airbus-Boeing dispute bilaterally. Between the UK and US in respect of UK and US interests. So we absolutely think that now the UK has left the European Union, that is an option open to us. We understand that Ambassador Lighthizer and USTR is open to a bilateral approach. So yes, we are strongly encouraging them to do that.
Great. Next question is for David. And it's, how has this affected your high-end, or Burton as well, how has this affected your high-end wines and spirit sales? The tariff is imposed as a percentage of cost. So, for instance, those 20-year-old single malts would obviously affect more than lower-cost wine and spirits.
Yeah, I mean, just as you would expect, the higher the cost, the more, you know, the tariff amount is. And initially everybody was trying to cover, everybody in the supply chain was trying to cover as much of the tariff as possible, but that time has passed, and consumers are going to just see those increases on a more and more regular basis, and the more costly the item is, the more the increase is going to be.
Question for Eric. Has there been any consideration on the part of USTR or the administration of the fact that so many of US companies have investment in European facilities and brands, and that these corporations will likely be hit on both sides of the aisle if this continues or worsens in a fight that they don't belong to? Is that something that they take into consideration?
They absolutely take that consideration, and that's why it's important to reach out, to talk to them, to provide the comments necessary, because they really I mean, they don't come to these decisions easily. There's a lot of thought and a lot of thorough process that goes into it. So what's most important, as I recommend to folks, is to really focus on the public comments to USTR and the reasoning behind those comments, and sharing and showing just what it feels like to your particular company, and how it has negatively impacted your company, those kinds of decisions, or those decisions under consideration.
And I think that Burton and David, you both did a really nice job today from my learning more about how that individual impact, impact is on your individual companies, I think is a really important story to tell. And so following up on what David said, you know, for people that are participating, exactly what Burton and David have shared is really the message to send out. Do you have others, Cody?
I do.
I know you have a lot in there. I see the comments.
I'm scrolling through them. Burton and David, can we expect even less expensive items from a lower price point like rosé to skyrocket in 2021 if tariffs of 25% or more persist, as it seems like rosé tariffs have been absorbed through the system in 2020? Are you encouraging domestic producers to try to beef up productions on categories like rosé in anticipation?
Well, the answer to the first part of the question is yes, the prices will go up. And it depends on what the tariff they put in place on Provence rosés or French rosés. The second part of the question, have we encouraged U.S. vineyards and wineries to grow rosé? Frankly, they don't need any encouragement. There's a fair amount of those rosés on the marketplace now, and that just puts more pressure on that category as itself. Now that category is growing, no question about it, but it's like anything else. I mean, if you're in San Francisco and you have sourdough bread, it's great, right? You go somewhere else, you try sourdough bread, that's not exactly the same. You know, so as David said before, you know, French restaurants, you know, part of their feel for what they're doing is French. Part of what they're trying to give that experience to their customer is French. The same with the Italian or Spanish or whatever. So, you know, prices for Provence rosé will definitely go up if the tariff is instituted. No question about it.
And Cody, if I can jump in, the other thing that I think you'll see happen that maybe people haven't considered is if tariffs get increased, those products, it just wouldn't make sense for us to import them and bring them in. So they won't be available. So eventually the prices will stop going up because they won't be here. People are just going to buy wines from other regions. They'll be forced into it, whether they want to or not. So, you know, it's going to affect selection and availability too.
Which is something that I think we all think is essentially un-American, right? Not having that choice and that selection doesn't feel like the kind of policies that we want to put in place, because right now we live in an environment where in the US we have the greatest variety of choice and options available to us, and this is part of how it happens.
The next question I think maybe will be most appropriate for Eric or Karen, and that's about the supplemental list, the possible expansion of tariffs to other products that are not currently being tariffed at the 25% rate. And the question is, you know, the expansion to vodka and gin and beer would only apply to the Airbus countries, which are also the ones currently subject to the 15% aircraft tariffs. But since no airline is buying new aircrafts now, do you think it's more or very likely that USTR will tariff these items to apply even more pressure on the 4 Airbus countries?
Why don't I start? I think if the data shows that they need to, with the WTO's decision last year, they're trying to find those numbers to get to that $7 point however billion dollars, and so far they haven't come close to doing that. They're looking at expanding. Again, that goes back to my point too on why it's so important that everybody certainly we speak up and share and show how that's going to affect us in the United States, those kind of decisions. But at the end of the day, they're going to go by they're going to look at that data and they're going to apply what they feel is necessary. And that's why, we need to make our voices heard.
And I mean, I would say, I don't know. Eric knows much more than I do about how USTR takes decisions. I mean, what I would say is that, it leaves everyone in this terrible position. So it's back to the original point that the parties need to negotiate. And, as a former litigation lawyer myself, I think 15 years of litigation is the definition of failure. And really, our governments need to get the companies involved together to sort out what happened, to come to a settlement on what happened, to sort out what our future policies are and agree them on support to large civil aircraft, and move on and take all of us out of the firing line, because it will undoubtedly be damaging. In fact, to many of the companies that produce Scotch whisky at the moment also produce gin. So, they're going to have even more of their portfolio subject to tariffs. It will damage Scotland particularly. In fact, 70% of British gin is produced in Scotland. So, there's really nothing good that can come from this. We are, as I say, putting a lot of pressure on the UK government to find a more creative and imaginative way out of this. Now the UK has left the EU, but I would apply that to the EU and the US as well. This is not our fight, and we shouldn't be paying the price for it.
Right. So Cody, I think we have time for probably 2 more questions.
Okay, this question is it's a political related question, and it's probably most appropriate for Eric. But if and when a new administration comes to power in November, what can we expect about continued tariffs?
I think they're going to be they're looking at the WTO decision. The WTO decision gave the green light to make up that $7 billion. I think, I don't want to speak for what a future administration would say, but I would think that they're looking at the same facts, and they're looking at this long history of this dispute. And I think, their actions would be similar, really, at the end of the day.
Okay, and I have one more question for Michelle. There's a deadline coming up in just a few days on July 26th for submitting comments to the USTR website to oppose tariffs on wine and spirits. It would be helpful to tell everyone how to do that and how we should be encouraging our employees as well as consumers to comment.
That's great, and I'm glad that one of my friends asked that question. It must have been. It's a great question. So for WSWA members, we have been communicating with you directly on how you can make comments to USTR, including providing you with docking points and sample letters. And so you have that from us in your email. If you don't, please feel free to reach out to any one of us on the team, me, Allie Gormley at allie@wswa.org, or Cody Tucker, Cody@wswa.org, and we can do that. For others who are on the call, you can always go to regs.gov, regulation.gov, and make the comments there. And send that in. And I think that's probably, like I said, there's really a couple of things when you're sending those messages to think about, and it's including the personal story of your company and the personal story of how this is impacting your company and what you're able to or not able to do because of the tariffs and the experience that you've had since the tariffs were first put in place back in October. And so that would be my advice. Cody, do you have other more specific?
No, I would just add that there on our website at WSWA.org, you can also find resources to contact USTR and members of Congress to urge the removal of tariffs.
Advice that you can give people?
And there you'll also find sample comments for folks.
Which is great. So I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. This was really a wonderful discussion. It's the thing that we're talking about internally all the time, and it's nice to be able to do that in this format. So for those of you who have been on, we are making a recording of this webinar available to everyone who has attended today and everyone that's registered. It's going to be posted on the WSWA website. And as Cody said there, you can also find resources to contact USTR and members of Congress to continue to spread this message of removing these tariffs on unrelated wine and spirits products. Lastly, I just want to remind everybody that WSWA is hosting a series of webinars throughout our year talking about different topics with experts like we've had today, and I hope that you can join us on those. I want to thank our panel today in particular, Karen, Eric, so nice to have you here, and to our WSWA members, Burton and David, always wonderful to be together and to do this advocacy work. We hope that all of you can join us in the future. Continue to look for eVites in your inbox and check on WSWA on social media. And for those of you who are WSWA members, make sure to check the weekly buzz. So thank you again and be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.